There's a lot of politics and a lot of potential treasons of all kinds
Absolutely.
running loose along with the money, right?
And these moments, these historical moments in which it seems like anything might happen are always very interesting to me, because when we look at history, we can say, oh, well, of course, there was never going to be, you know, a successful Stuart Revolution in Hanoverian England. That could never have happened. But people living in that moment didn't know that. And it always seemed, and the country had been through all these upheavals in the previous century, that it seemed like the entire way of life was always threatening to be pulled out from under them. And that always makes for an interesting background for a novel in which people feel like the very foundation of their society can at any moment just radically shift.
Absolutely. But you had some pretty high-powered political figures messing around in the bubble. I think Robert Goddard wrote a book relatively recently, or relatively soon after Conspiracy of Paper, in which his treatment of it was much more political than economic. I think he thought even the monarch's skirts might have been a little brushed up against all this.
There were a lot of people involved, and one of the interesting things was it was after the bubble burst, it was sort of like, do you remember after Enron? All these politicians came forward and to condemn Enron, and the more money they'd received in donations from Enron, the more vehemently they challenged it. They attacked it, and something very similar happened with the South Sea bubble, which was all these politicians who had been in on the take were very quick to condemn what had happened, and the one major politician who hadn't been on the take was Robert Walpole. And he used that because he was in many ways insulated. He basically came up with a settlement that was the sort of the $700 billion bailout of its day.
Right. Exactly.
And he felt like he was the only one who could do this because he wasn't tainted, and so he could be accused of being in on things because he wasn't, and that really cemented his rise to power.
It did, actually. It's fascinating that he used it as political capital.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, why is it that people, you know, don't really remember? I find it so interesting. It's all happened before, and it's as though nobody remembers.
Well, you know, I think, you know, whenever there's some kind of disaster, it creates a vacuum of power, and when you can look at it very clinically from above, but when you're in the middle of it, it's probably harder to see exactly what's going on. You're just more worried about whether or not, you know, you're going to be worth anything tomorrow.
Right. Well, one of the other tensions, and then we'll move on to the Whiskey Rebels, I remember it particularly in The Coffee Trader, but also for your guy, Benjamin Weaver, is that, you know, they're at odds. Some of what they're doing, particularly Miguel in Amsterdam, is at odds with the rules that govern the Portuguese Jewish trading community.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so not only is he gambling on cornering coffee, so to speak, but he's also gambling on his place in the community, which could be a pretty terrible thing then, because, you know, social services weren't a big deal, and
right.
you needed your community
right.
to take care of you.
And you know, it was an interesting thing for me to write about because again, it's one of those things that we can see very clearly in the light of history that people living at the moment couldn't. But this community of Jews in Amsterdam had come over principally from the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, where they suffered a horrible oppression, and the Jews that came over were people who had been forced to live secretly as Jews for sometimes for generations.
Right.
And they had had in their cultural memory a time of great success in Spain and Portugal, in which they lived very well and
under
they were
the Moors.
accepted. That's
when
right.
the Moors governed Spain, it was a very tolerant country.
And so there was this cultural memory of living among people who were tolerant, and then suddenly things becoming radically different, and they were very afraid that, okay, the Dutch are treating us well now, but who's to say what's going to happen tomorrow? And when we can say, well, of course, you know, because of these factors, the Dutch were never going to do that, but they didn't know it. And so the way they tried to politically and socially and emotionally protect themselves was by laying down all these rules, these very strict rules of behavior, to make it very difficult for people in the Dutch community to say, oh, look at those terrible Jews, look at these terrible things they're doing. They wanted to protect themselves as much as possible from, accusations of crime by Jews, or prostitution by Jews, or begging by Jews. They wanted to be as invisible and useful as possible. And so this is something that Miguel comes up against, because he, in many ways, is a fairly devout person and a fairly, in his own way, I think, a kind of a good person. But he keeps bumping up against these rules that he sees as unjust and unnecessary. And so he's, he belongs nowhere as a result. And of course, those are always the most fun characters to write about.
They are, but I also think that, as a novelist, an outsider, the guy that is always sort of outside the structure of whatever society, makes a good sleuth, too.
Of course, because you can go places, and in many ways you're very conspicuous, but in other ways you're invisible. And, it gives you, being an outsider gives you a certain kind of power as well, because you have less to lose than somebody who's wired into a society. So you can take risks, and you can be daring, and you can put things on the line, because you're already in this bad position anyhow.
And you can talk to more people. So Benjamin, you've done 2 cases with him. You did a conspiracy of people, and then you did a spectacle of corruption. And are you working on did I read a 3rd one for him?
Yeah, the 3rd one is coming out. It's done. It's coming out a year from now. It's called The Devil's Company. And it is about I would describe it as about the 18th century origins of the modern corporation.
Wonderful.
It's about the British East India Company, and some interesting moments that are happening in the 1720s with them.
You, and as part of your career, were a door-to-door Bible salesman?
Encyclopedia.
Encyclopedia.
Yeah.
Of course not Bible.
Yeah,
Sorry,
no.
that was one of my
I was totally
moments
a
there.
secular door-to-door book
Got it.
salesman.
No. It just popped out. But anyway, encyclopedias, and the reason I mentioned it is that there's a book I don't have here on the table that you wrote called The Ethical Assassins,
Yes.
in which your character is a door-to-door encyclopedia salesman,
Right.
and as a result is selling, presumably doing a sales talk when 2 people are murdered.
Right. The opening scene of this novel is he's in a mobile home, and I can tell you from my experience that's how we were trained. You always go for trailers. You never try and sell books to people who might already have them, and it was a very manipulative trade, a very kind of nasty business, and I didn't last long in it. But he's in a trailer, and he's selling to a couple, and just as he's about to close the deal, a stranger walks into the trailer and shoots both of the customers dead. And he says to Lem, my main character, don't worry, I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not a murderer. I'm an assassin. Do what I tell you to do, and you'll be fine. And he takes his driver's license, so he learns his name, and he makes Lem put his fingerprints on the gun. And he says, if you just go your own way, if you don't tell anybody I was here, if you don't tell anybody you saw anything, I won't bother you. But if you try and get me in trouble, the police will find this gun with your fingerprints on it.
Wow.
And sends him away, and he thinks that's the end of it. He gets picked up by his crew boss, and he goes back to the motel, because these troops always traveled. So you would spend 4 or 5 days a week on the road, and we would all stay in these terrible motels. So he goes back to his motel, and the assassin is there waiting for him. And that's how the novel takes off.
That's a wonderful setup.
I was very happy with it. I really had fun writing that.
Are there any door-to-door encyclopedia salesmen today?
I don't know. I doubt it.
I do too. I'm afraid Google and Wikipedia and all have just wiped out the need for it.
I think the combination of the internet, of being able to order books so quickly, and being able to look up information so quickly, and the general fear we have of letting strangers into our home, have probably together pretty much crushed.
Like the old traveling tinker that would come around and sharpen knives and things is probably...
Although I could use one of those.
Wow, couldn't we all? We used to have milk delivered when I was a child, and we had a pieman in the Chicago suburbs, north of Chicago. Every Saturday morning, this man would come around with, cakes and pies and everything, and it was absolutely great. I used to eat half an apple pie for breakfast on Saturday morning. Where is that?
I think that's probably just a matter of overhead and and profitability. Whereas with the door-to-door salesman, I think it's probably just very hard to get people to let you into their home for 2 or 3 hours, which is what it took to
To sell
close
one.
an encyclopedia deal.